The 50% penalty and what's now, and you could have added H1B, you could have added pharma tariffs. Dr. Sajid Z, Chenoy, Head of Asia Economics and Chief India Economist at JPMorgan. Dr. Sameeran Chakravarti, Chief Economist, India at Citibank. And Tanvi Gupta Jain, Chief India Economist at UBS. Some of the finest minds in this space, those who track not just the Indian economy, but global economies and have a very good finger on the pulse of what's happening. And we will, through this session, as I request them all to come up on stage here, we will try and understand what are the policy options for India. What do we do now? Please join us on stage. Tanvi, I'm going to start with you. What now after 50% penalty, and between then and now we had the H1B shock. We'll probably have more immigration-related decisions from there. We've heard what's happened on branded pharma. There's a spillover effect on generic Indian pharma stocks. So if anybody here has an interest, it was a sea of red there. And who knows what President Trump is going to think of doing next. So what now for India?
Sure. Thanks for having me here. Let's start with where we are before I have my thoughts on what's next. A 50% penalty, which is 25% reciprocal tariff and 25% penalty for buying military equipments and oil from Russia. It is one of the highest across EM. I would say it's almost double than what we are seeing in our ASEAN peers, which is somewhere between 15 and 19%. The effective tariff rate for India is 32%, but now we have the pharma tariff which has been announced. We still have to see what's the effective rate. But I would say the 32 or 34% effective rate is still higher than even Brazil, where the announced tariff is 50%. Now, if I look at what's the impact on the macroeconomy, I would say roughly around $35 billion of our goods are exposed to higher US tariff, which is almost to the tune of 0.8% of GDP. So if I look at in terms of sectors, I would say it is largely affecting the low margin, low value added sectors like gems and jewelry, apparel, textiles, leather, footwear, etc. And almost 20 to 30% of these sectors have a production which is exported. And here we are talking about 10 to 15 million people who are employed in these labor intensive sectors getting exposed because of higher US tariff. So yes, the situation does not look very exciting right now. We do see a GDP growth drag because of these higher tariffs, but we are always hopeful. So if I look at where we are at our GDP growth estimates for India, despite having a 50% tariff, we are at 6.7% GDP growth for FY26 and a 6.3% GDP growth for FY27. So what we have assumed in our base case is that the 25% penalty gets withdrawn sometime around November, December. So that's all the hope we all have at this point in time. But in case we don't see that penalty getting withdrawn, I think there will be a knockdown impact coming from employment, floating into consumption, and definitely capex. So let's see how does it go from here.
Okay, so that was Tanvi talking about the downside, and we should all be very hopeful. I would say that we should all be very hopeful. But as I walked into this session, a professor of management said, you must ask these economists this question, should India retaliate? So I'm going to try with you, Sajid, because this is the sentiment on the street. Yeah. Retaliate, hit back, punch hard, because it's the way they have the Indian economy is a dead economy, and the way we've never had anyone speak in the diplomatic sort of standards of speech, the manner in which India has been kind of spoken about in the last 3-4 months. So that stoked a popular sentiment. Is it even possible for us to retaliate?
Thanks, Siddharth. Good to be here. From a narrow economic perspective, very simple answer, no. We have much more to lose from retaliation and escalation, and I think the government's been very mature about not escalating this. The focus is very much on goods, which is 1% of GDP in value add. These are highly labor-intensive sectors, and we should talk about the steps we can take to protect these small enterprises. But there's much more at stake. Last Friday, we spoke about H-1B visas. That's the tip of the iceberg. The real vulnerability India has is on service exports. Total goods exports are 1% of GDP to the US in terms of exports. Total service exports are about 7% of GDP, right? That's the epicenter of urban consumption, the white-collar jobs we've seen the last few years, housing. So we have more to lose if we were to escalate this process. I think we have to put our head down, and I'm very glad to see negotiations are back on track, and hopefully some common ground can be found. I really believe purely on the economic front, there is a deal to be had here. I'm an old-fashioned economist where trade is about win-win. It's not a zero-sum game. If India gets preferential access to the US in labor-intensive sectors, and US gets access to a large growing market, both sides can win. But in the meantime, Siddharth, there are things we need to do. And the good news is we've had a playbook from COVID. COVID was very similar in that there was a sudden demand shutdown. And my worry is for these small enterprises in these sectors, gems and jewelry, leather, textiles, footwear, shrimp, the US is 50-60% of demand. So when your tariff is 50% and your competitors are 18, 20, 25, you'll see a sudden demand shutdown. Now, what India needs to do is, while we negotiate this deal, policy has to provide a bridge to keep these enterprises alive. And the example from COVID was, we had used targeted sectoral measures, regulatory forbearance, a credit guarantee scheme, liquidity, targeted fiscal support. The good news is every exporter works through the banking system. Right. So we can target exactly who's exposed, right? So if we can do that in the near term, keep these enterprises alive, because once you start layoffs, then there are knock-on effects on consumption. You lose entrepreneurial capital, you use institutional capital. Once the firm shuts down, even if you have a trade deal 3 months later, the damage is done. So I think the near-term impact is don't escalate, negotiate in good faith, and provide a bridge to keep these enterprises alive till, hopefully some trade deal can be achieved.
You've given us several points, and I think given what Sajid just said, if in the public imagination you thought this was a trade war, what they are telling us is don't even look at it from a war perspective. It's far more calibrated and nuanced. Sameeran, do you agree with this point that Sajid left us with in his answer, that the government policy needs to act and act now before layoffs and other unpleasant consequences spill over into the economy?
So I think, as Sajid was mentioning, it's important that we arrest this as quickly as possible. But there are two other aspects also we need to be conscious of. One is that to have a slightly more medium-term view on whether the world is going to become more protectionist going forward, and how our policies should shape to live in a more protectionist world. And the second aspect is that, and this is, we all know this, that when there is a fire, then we act. So can we treat this as a fire and act on stuff on which we might have been delaying in the past in taking decisions? And for all of us in this room, an example of the second thing is obviously this GST cut. This GST cut could have come 2 years back, but the fact that we are now pushed into taking some difficult decisions, maybe that's why this has been pushed forward now. The example of the first is where I think we need to really think hard, that we had this view that we will have X basis point of GDP coming out of export growth. We'll have this $1 trillion goods export by 2030 and $1 trillion service exports, and trying to model our future growth on the back of that. Is this something that we now need to reconsider and put more domestic growth drivers in play? I think that's something on which I'm not seeing enough discussion happening. Yes, loosely we are saying we have to do some deregulation here or some interest rate cut there, which will boost domestic demand. But beyond that, my sense is that Yes, the world economy in the last 100 years have seen several times moving from globalization to protectionism, and
Absolutely.
that pendulum has swung. So maybe in 10 years' time, the pendulum can swing back. But for the foreseeable future, it looks like protectionism is going to be here for a while. Even if we get this limited trade deal, it's not funny that now we are almost aspiring to get a 15 to 20% tariff. We will treat this
Base
as
level expectations have been
exactly.
reset.
So, yeah, right. So that 15-20% tariff is going to be so protectionist. And let's not forget that today, in a prisoner's dilemma sense,
Right.
we are thinking that, oh, US is going to benefit out of this 15-20% tariff. What's the guarantee that tomorrow another country is not going to?
Well, you
that.
were right. The United States is telling Europe to also impose penalties on India. Tanvi, I want to come to you because what Sameeran has basically said, and I'm framing a question around it, if 3 to 4 decades of globalization brought us to a certain per capita income and growth trajectory, is that prosperity, is that story of the past 30, 40 years, and it's been a secular growth story across governments, across cycles, is that under risk according to you as an economist?
Okay, so if I look at largely from a medium term or a long term, how do we see India's growth panning out in a reverse globalization or a globalized world? I would say in the last 1 decade or last 2 decades, at best, the India growth story has averaged around 6% kind of a dual GDP growth.
Yeah.
And in the next decade, I would say the growth that we are estimating in our base case is more towards 6 and 6.5%. And depending upon how the reverse globalization or protectionism is going to behave, we need to see whether the growth can even sustain beyond 6% in the long term. So where India has the biggest advantage and where India can capitalize in this environment of protectionism is a domestic demand story, which Sameeran was also highlighting. I mean, India is a largely domestic demand-driven story. Exports as a share of GDP is one of the lowest, at least in goods export in EM. Services is definitely something that we are watching very closely, whether services exports come under any kind of tax ambit. But if India is able to focus on structural reforms to boost domestic demand story, that is where the biggest opportunity for India is in a scenario of reverse globalization or protectionism that we are seeing right now.
Okay, reverse globalization. Those of you who are interested in this subject, remember that word because this wasn't something that I had expected to talk with very, very senior and seasoned economists even 6 months ago. So that's how times have changed. Sajid, I want to come to you. Are the goals of Viksit Bharat by 2047, all the goals under threat if you were to try and look ahead at this point of time?
Let me make a couple of points, short term and medium term. I think the short term is while we do focus on a lot of external headwinds, let's not forget there are some building domestic supports, at least in the near term. What are those? We're seeing inflation at 2.5% this year, the lowest in at least a decade. That means purchasing power for consumers picks up. We've seen a 100 basis point rate easing cycle from the RBI, which is playing through the system. We've seen another strong monsoon, rural demand is picking up. We saw direct tax cuts in February, we're now seeing large indirect tax cuts now. So there are 5 mutually reinforcing factors that should help consumption going forward. The hope is the consumption pickup is long enough to translate into some investment pickup. So the outlook really is this tug of war between external headwinds and domestic tailwinds. But your question is broader about the next 20 years, and I want to build on something Sameeran said. I actually think the outlook for emerging markets is even more daunting than we think, because emerging markets like India are going to face 3 mutually reinforcing shocks. The first is this absence of globalization. Let me give you one statistic. Only 13 economies since the Second World War have averaged 7% growth over 25 years, which India needs to do. They all had one thing in common. They grew on the back of exports and global demand. So India's challenge is how do you grow exports for the next 20 years in a more deglobalized world? Number 2, emerging markets face what I call a China shock 2.0. China is sitting on massive excess capacity. The US has put on large tariffs on China. China is redirecting those exports to Asia, to India, to the Middle East, to North Africa. So now, not only are exports under threat, but you have to play defense and try and protect your manufacturing sector, not protection through tariffs, but to try and ward off the threat of cheap Chinese imports.
And there are industrial sectors who are already raising red flags about Chinese imports.
And the third driver for me is a lot of automation. that you see capital labor ratios around the world have gone up sharply. For every unit of output, humanity is using more machines and fewer workers. And this is even before AI. So if you're an emerging market looking at the next 20 years, you're thinking exports are more of a challenge. You're playing defense on Chinese imports, and job creation is really hard, right? So what does one do? I'll end with this. I think the premium on being competitive has never been higher. You have to become competitive. Our share of global manufacturing exports is 2%. It doesn't matter if the pie doesn't grow. If we can take our share from 2% to 5%, that will drive export growth. If you've got more competitiveness, you can try and ward off cheap Chinese imports. So structural reform is really important. I'm hopeful. I think these shocks create political space for reform. GST, forget about the rate cuts. It's the simplification which is the reform. We have 2 high-level committees on deregulation and next-generation reforms. Let's hope that that process, provides more reforms in the coming months and quarters.
Sameeran, is President Trump doing India a favor?
I don't know whether it's a favor or not, but it's, in a way, we are waking up from a slumber. We were probably getting a bit complacent that this 7-8% growth will come almost automatically. Now, as we were discussing in this panel, that we are just about $3,000 per capita economy, which needs to do a lot to get up on the curve. So whether this is simply because of this shock, that's debatable, but I'm happy that we are talking about things like deregulation, which is generally not sexy enough. And from a political standpoint, that's why sometimes this is not urgent or immediate, which is why it gets pushed back. Now we are...
Should Viksit Bharat be defined as $10,000 per capita by 2047, and is it even possible?
Look, I mean, this is, to me, a goal, a lodestar for us to work towards. It's not a question that we can answer sitting in 2025, that what our GDP is going to be in 2047. If any economist says that we have that crystal ball with us to forecast 2047...
I will toss that question to your co-panelist. Tanvi, you. Take a shot at that, please.
No, my sense is that it's a good lodestar to have,
okay,
for us to work towards.
Is that a polite way of saying that it's not going to happen?
No, look, as Sajid was mentioning, that if you look at last 70, 80 years of world economic history, the countries which have got that 7-8% GDP growth, Sajid mentioned the point about export growth. I will bring in 2 additional points. They've got at least 10% investment growth and at least 3% productivity growth. If we are going to get 10% investment growth and 3% productivity growth, then we are going to reach that number, that magic number. Because otherwise, it's very tough to say that this is going to be a linear path. Because what happens typically is that as a country's per capita income grows, the natural pace of convergence comes off. Today, it's easier to grow at 7%. When our per capita income will grow to $6,000, it's not so easy to get that same 7% growth. So it's never going to be a linear path. And as we have witnessed in the last 5 years or so, there will be multiple shocks in the process. So I'm not as concerned about whether we'll meet that number. To me, the path is also equally important.
Tanvi, that same question, and I just add something that we've seen a certain switch in the government strategy. COVID, we saw a certain kind of intervention from a policy point of view, but with the income tax recalibration, with the GST cut, and the monetary policy easing cycle, I sense that the government has decided to shift course and a change of gears. Do you agree with that? They are now realizing that perhaps more direct intervention on the consumption side, demand side is going to work in this scenario. Will it work?
Okay. It's a very valid point. During the pandemic, we saw a lot of focus on capex spending by the government. We saw all the measures to boost manufacturing in terms of production-linked incentive schemes getting announced. And the entire focus was that once the government capex starts turning around, it will create conducive conditions for the corporate capex to turn around. We looked at the data of 4,500 listed companies, and I would say there is a marginal recovery. 3% capex spending by listed companies went up to 3.2, 20 basis point in the last 5 years, which is nothing meaningful to be proud of.
So did corporate India, to make it simple for the audience, did corporate India focus more on their own profits rather than investment?
So since the pandemic, we have seen a lot of corporates have improved their balance sheet, they have deleveraged, they are sitting on cash, but they are not investing yet. And one very interesting data point which I must share. So what we are seeing, especially in, across the world, is a second shock to China. In the last 2 years, China's exports to the world is up 20%, when the rest of the world exports are up 6%. And most of these exports, as Sajid was also mentioning, are going to EM. Now coming back to India, since we are discussing India here, India's trade deficit with China on goods front is up 2.5 times since the pandemic. And if I look at the sectors, you will realize that most of the imports from China are all manufacturing driven. So our manufacturing sector is very largely influenced by China's imports. So now when I say that yes, the government is focusing on consumption-led growth in the hope that the corporate gets some incentive to go and start investing because the capitalizations levels go up, maybe that's a good start. So moving from investment-led growth to consumption-driven growth in the hope of creating conducive conditions now for the corporate to invest maybe is a good strategy from a policymaker's point of view. But yes, we need to find the Indian companies go and start investing, because if you look at the 2004 to 8 cycle, or when the time when India's investment rate went up from 24% of GDP in 2004 to as high as 38% of GDP, post, at the bull market, the entire increase was led by the corporate capex. Almost a 13 percentage point increase in investment cycle was led by the corporates. So right now, I hope that this entire consumption stimulus, almost to the tune of $60 billion, is the economic stimulus announced by the government, and the RBI is hoping that the consumption is going to be the bright spot, which create conducive conditions for now the corporates eventually to start investing.
Right. What I'm going to do in the remaining 4 minutes is to go across the panel, starting with Sajid, and ask him, what is he looking forward to hear from North Block? By the way, North Block, the Finance Ministry has moved from North Block to this new Secretariat building, but Mint Street, the RBI is still where it is. So what does he hope to hear from Delhi and Mumbai in the next quarter, which will tell Sajid that things are on track and we realize the scope of the challenge and are up to it?
Just 10 seconds before that, Siddharth, on, you have to identify what is the binding constraint on growth. For many years, 15 years ago, when we were first talking, the binding constraint was supply. India was a supply-constrained economy, agricultural production, bank credit growth,
and inflation
leverage,
as a result.
right? And the problem was imbalances. That's gone. The government has systematically, unbottlenecked those supply constraints. The constraint today is demand, which is a new constraint India has faced for the first time in many decades. So I think the near-term fiscal and monetary stimulus is appropriate to boost demand. Now, what should one look for in the near term? I think some targeted sectoral policy package based on COVID-like measures to keep these enterprises alive would be important. I think the results of these two committees are important. Deregulations is an amorphous thing, but very often a number of small little things add up to make the cost of doing business much lower. So in the next 3 months, you'd hope to see both deregulation reforms. The labor codes were passed in 2019-20 by Parliament. States have not implemented them. If we can push states to implement those labor codes, it sends a powerful signal that India is open for business. I'll end with this, that what we need to do to sustain demand in the medium term, when fiscal space is constrained, for the capex cycle to pick up, they need to see demand visibility. For that, in a world where exports are uncertain, you need consumption to grow. But for consumption to grow, you need income visibility to the household. In other words, you need to give labor the best possible chance to compete with capital. How do you make labor a more attractive factor of production? That requires old school stuff, education, health, skilling, labor laws. It's easy to be heterodox, but I think let's go back to first principles. That's the basis on which you get income visibility, consumption visibility, and then you'll see a private capex cycle.
Sameeran, if I had a politician on the panel, he would have responded perhaps by saying, hey, great stuff you economists are talking, but just earlier today the Prime Minister announced a massive package of direct transfers to women in Bihar. That's the way the political establishment at the center is trying to address this problem. Do you think that helps?
Look, I mean, as I said, that we are a $3,000 per capita economy where some of these transfers are the reality of life. We can't move out of them. But to me, to answer your earlier question about what we want to see, and I'm slightly provocative here in saying that India needs a new growth narrative which stands out from the other growth narratives across the world. If you think of today's underperformance of Indian assets vis-a-vis the rest of the world this year, the reason is simply that other parts of the world has created some narratives for them, whether it is the AI narrative, whether it's a defense spending narrative in Europe. Everybody has created something which is attracting capital. There is enough capital available in the world, so much that it's chasing a gold or a platinum or a silver also. But it's not coming into India because whatever our old narrative, I'm not saying that narrative is not good. That's a good narrative, whether it's a democracy narrative, domestic, but those narratives have already been priced in.
India needs a new growth narrative. Last 30 seconds to you, Tanvi, what can that narrative be to turn the tide?
From my perspective, I mean, you are doing a lot of consumption stimulus. That's not sustainable. It has to be an investment-led growth. For that, structural reforms is the only biggest narrative that the government can swing for growth to be more towards the medium-term potential of 6.5.
I'll just end by narrating a small anecdote that when the government did a 2019 significant cut in corporate taxes, the hope was that private sector, the corporate India, the barons would come up and invest. That didn't happen. We've seen several phases since then. Perhaps the government at the center, and the states must also realize and pick up the ball, is now to switch gears, as our panel of fantastic economists have just told us. Thank you very much for your time with us today. Thank you.